So this morning you might notice that we are back in a circle instead of being in rows. Part of the intention of my message this morning is to sort of turn things on their head and reorient how we think about things, which is a little bit harder to do than it is to say. And there's a lot that goes into this, and I want to specifically mention that a lot of this has been inspired by Black woman Casey Overton, who uses she and they pronouns and writes for Enfleshed. And she raised a point in a commentary about this text that I had never noticed, thought of, or had pointed out to me before. But won't come back to that in a minute. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's hard to reorient your viewpoints when you have seen things the same way before. So a couple things come to my mind. One is the saying that history is written by the winners. So you have to think about who won anything that's happened in the past and who's telling the story, which is usually the people who have power. And usually the story that they want to tell is one that reflects well on them. I'm the same way. I only want stories that reflect well on me told. Think about when you've been at holiday parties and parents like to tell embarrassing stories about their children. Who has the power in those moments? Usually parents have power over their children, so the stories are embarrassing to the children rather than to the parents. I also think about Hamilton. I have never actually seen it, but there's, I believe it's Hamilton, a song lyric that says, "Were you there in the room when it happened?" Which again sort of emphasizes who gets to tell the story of what's happened, who gets to say who the quote-unquote good people were. And part of rearranging the layout in worship this morning is because the church does this as well. The church emphasizes this story as told from the pulpit and the lectern, which is told by people who have been brought up in the church and people who have been educated in seminaries and gone to some sort of training and generally are told the same ways of interpreting the history of the church, the scripture of the church, to often in well-meaning and well-intentioned ways reinforce what the church teaches. So I put everything in circle, and you'll notice, something that I noticed anyway, is that everybody still sat in this half of the circle facing the front. And I'm sure part of that is for a variety of reasons. You may want to be able to see the screen. You may want to be able to see Bill while he's playing. You may have noticed that Lance and I were sitting on this side. That last one kind of is part of the reorientation that I was going for, is you are still all sitting opposite Lance and I as the quote-unquote leaders of worship this morning. We do still have the elements of communion at the center, because that, I think, is a valuable aspect of what we are centering here. So now, taking all of this in mind as we look at this scripture passage, it's a well-known passage. It's one that we talk about in Sunday schools, and it's at least 3 movies or cinema adaptations that I know of. Off the top of my head, probably more. I'm sure most of you have seen one or another of them. has the story always focused, as you've heard it, on Joseph and Israel as the good people and his brothers as the bad people who did something wrong? I would imagine so, because that's what Casey points out in her commentary on this passage. They write that there are two verses in this passage that usually get overlooked, and they're the opening verses. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. So this passage does something that we don't get a lot of in the Bible, which is actually name two women, and two women who could be defined as lower status or marginalized because they are the sort of concubines or secondary wives to Israel, Israel. Rachel is the true wife, the one who is anticipated to sort of be the bearer of the line. And Casey, they point out that this is sort of a generational thing in this story of, well, Bilhah and Zilpah are secondary choices, consolations. So their children, the brothers who are mentioned in this passage, would also then be sort of these second-class, lesser favored children of Israel. And this is not to highlight this and say, well, what they did to Joseph was right or just. It's to reframe it and say, well, what else could they have done? They were tattled on by their favorite, the brother who was favored. They were likely always second class, getting the scraps of food, getting the hand-me-downs, only being offered the field trip or the trip to the city with Israel if Joseph couldn't go. And this is on top of the treatment that their mothers had already received. And Casey points out again that there's, especially in African traditions, this idea of ancestors who are not only ancestors past, but ancestors who are still present with us today. And they reference a Jungian thought that says every woman is not only herself, but her mother and her mother's mother and her mother's mother's mother. And in this sense, you carry forth what your family has experienced over the years. Today we might sort of call that generational trauma and think about it in relation to racism and attempts to heal from racism. But it certainly, for me, made me think about how have I never had that pointed out to me before, that these two women were important enough to be named in Scripture that does not usually name them, and then to immediately be glossed over in all of the rest of the story with no more attention paid to them, to be glossed over in most of church history and church teaching, to move on to the story of Joseph and his beautiful coats and how he is in Egypt and how he carries the faith forward, and not to think about the ways that the faithful, being Joseph and Israel and Rachel, have treated those that they thought they had power over, who they were able to have power over because of their culture and the societal expectations. So the question for us is, what does that mean for us today? Whose names do we know just enough to be able to name them, but not to be able to recognize their role in the story? Who do we think has been unjust or unjust in retaliation for the harm they have faced when we are not acknowledging everything that they've gone through? So thinking about what justice means for us today, thinking about how we frame justice culturally in a retributive justice sense, where you are punished for the harm that you've done to learn your lesson, where you're incarcerated and lose anything that you might have had going for you prior to that. And yet then, once you've served your time, still continue to face the punishments of not being able to vote and not having access to particular parts of society because you've been marked with the scarlet letter, to use a different generational metaphor, moving us forward to, the Puritan times rather than the biblical times. What would it look like if we started moving towards restorative justice practices, where there's hope for restored communities and conversation and understanding? Because quite honestly, the research is out there that the retributive justice attempts at stopping anything bad from happening in the future don't work. And generally that's, again, compounded upon those who are being punished. And logically, again, it doesn't even make sense if the idea is that you did this, so your punishment is X number of years, but X number of years is not the end of your punishment. So, again, to kind of reorient things some and stop my voice from being the only one that is reacting to this story and reflecting upon this moment of, well, I had never heard that before. I want to take a few moments. Yeah, I think we have time to do this. We're going to take about 5 minutes, and I'm going to invite you to talk with somebody next to you if you're a verbal processor, or if you're an internal processor and would be more comfortable writing or drawing or doodling. I'll go get some paper from the office for you and some pens. But think about one of those moments where you've experienced that sort of eye-opening of, well, I've always thought of this way, and somebody was able to tell you, well, that's not the only way to see it. And think about and talk about, if you so choose, what opened you to be able to experience that moment? What made you able to open your mind and take in that different perspective? And actually, I think Dale's question from the end of the children's moment is a good one to tack on here, is when there is a rule that is unfair and unjust, how do we work towards breaking down the fence so that the unfair or unjust rule or law is no longer the one in power? All of that said, take 5 minutes, talk with a neighbor, or doodle or draw as you feel so led.